Hello, Lisa. Hey, you like the new glasses? They're those like computer kind of like blue light type things. After I've been staring at a computer screen for 4 hours now a day, needs something. I am getting old. Plus, added bonus, I get to do stuff like this. Good times, good times. All right. Joke of the day. So, mountains, they aren't just funny, they're hilarious. Uh, Worth a shot. All right. So for today, we'll be talking about Vietnam. So we'll be starting our conversation on Vietnam. A little bit of background, and then basically up to the moment where it becomes just a small U.S. military engagement, doing full on kind of thing. So that'll be the Tonkin Gulf incident. So that's what we have for you guys today. Um, some short video clips also that I hope work. I don't know if they're going to work. They're part of a Ken Burns documentary in Vietnam, which was excellent. But I had to access them through a PBS site, so I think you should have access to them. But they're great little primary source, excellent interviews. Some pretty good stuff there. So we have that for you guys today. Yeah. So your NEA papers are due by the end of school today. So that's at 12:30. Can't wait to read those. But yeah, okay. I hope all is well. Stay safe, stay smart, and talk to you guys later. So today we'll begin our conversation on Vietnam and the Vietnam War. The backstory here, or the back history, um, is that before World War II, Vietnam was a French colony. During World War II, it was kind of occupied and controlled by the Japanese. And then after World War II, it was feeling within Vietnam that Vietnam would become an independent country. Much like Korea had become an independent country, Vietnam thought the same would happen to them. Unfortunately for Vietnam, that doesn't happen. And with US backing, France returns, and Vietnam once again becomes a colony of the French. Almost immediately, you have a rebellion within Vietnam led by the gentleman you see on your screen, Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh leads this insurrection against French colonialism. He is popular in Vietnam, and he's also a communist, which gets our attention as we're in the middle of the Cold War. And so there's this idea of called the domino theory, in which when one country becomes communist, the thought was countries near it might also become communist. And in the idea of containment, this is something that, of course, we don't want to happen. So if you think we start with the Soviet Union, and then China becomes a communist country, and then North Korea becomes a communist country, and now Vietnam might become a communist country, and then as you can see, it goes on and on and on. So while the US could not militarily assist the French in the 1950s in Vietnam because we were busy in Korea, we could send them money. And we sent billions of dollars to France to spend in Vietnam, and we wanted them to spend it on infrastructure. Instead, the French used that money to kind of build up their own economy. And so, as this insurrection gets bigger and bigger, the French gamble. And what their military decides is if that they could fight one big open field battle against Ho Chi Minh and his forces, which were known as the Viet Minh, that they could easily defeat these communist forces. So they pick a place called Dien Bien Phu, and the location is just mind-boggling. So as you can see, it's all the way up in northern Vietnam, so it's close to communist China. That in itself is interesting, but it's also in a valley, which strategically makes zero sense. The French, of course, felt they were safe here because they believed there was no way that Ho Chi Minh's forces could climb those mountains and get artillery up there. Well, Ho Chi Minh figures out how to do that, and the French then find themselves trapped. They appeal to Eisenhower for help. Eisenhower is dead set against this. His advisors tell him that this would be a mistake to get involved in a ground war in Southeast Asia, and you can see the quote there that you have on the screen from him. So Eisenhower refuses to help the French. The French hold out for as long as they possibly can, and after 55 days, they surrender. And as part of that surrender, they basically turn Vietnam over make Vietnam independent. The French are going to leave. That now causes problems for the United States because Ho Chi Minh now seems like he would be the guy who would step in and take over, and Vietnam then would become a communist country. So we need an alternative to Ho Chi Minh. So what we help kind of negotiate is that Vietnam will be divided in half, much like we did in Korea. It'll be divided at the 17th parallel into two Vietnams, a North Vietnam and a South Vietnam. North Vietnam, the northern part of the country, will be controlled by Ho Chi Minh. The southern part of Vietnam will be controlled by the gentleman you see also on your screen, a gentleman by the name of Ngo Dien, Ngo Diem. Easy for me to say, right? Diem. And the thought was that you'd eventually have an election between these two gentlemen, Diem in the south and Ho Chi Minh in the north. Each would control their own areas. They would show how they would govern, and then there'd be an election, and people could choose between the way Ho Chi Minh, how it was going in the north, or how it was going in the south with Diem. The problem is Diem is corrupt. Diem doesn't have popular support. He wasn't around to fight against the French, so he doesn't have credibility on that. And so very quickly it looks like that if there was going to be an election, that our man is going to lose. So those elections are never going to happen. And you can imagine people in South Vietnam who are looking for the opportunity to get rid of leadership that they do not like. They're not going to be too happy with that. And what you have happening in South Vietnam is a civil war. And you have an organization called the National Liberation Front kind of rises up and they fight against the government of South Vietnam. And the National Liberation Front, of course, is supported by Ho Chi Minh and those up in northern Vietnam. And so Diem now finds himself fighting a civil war within South Vietnam. He asks the United States for help. Again, the U.S. is reluctant. And Diem brilliantly kind of remarkets, repackages his opponents. They're no longer the National Liberation Front. He now simply calls them the VC. And the VC stands for the Vietnamese Communists. Once we hear that, communists, that triggers the domino theory in our minds. And now you have both Eisenhower and eventually President Kennedy saying that we will send whatever support that Diem needs. And so Kennedy in 1961 sends 9,000 military, quote, advisors to South Vietnam. And of course, this is coming after the Bay of Pigs, which Kennedy needs to look tough somewhere, and so he's going to do it here in South Vietnam. And so those 9,000 military advisors are supposedly training the South Vietnamese Army, who are known as ARVN, or the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN. And so the Americans fight alongside them. The Americans go out on missions with them. The Americans are flying planes. The Americans are teaching them how to use tanks. And of course, Americans are getting killed in this civil war. Eventually, the United States realizes that Diem is not up to the task, and we kind of look the other way when a military coup happens in 1963 and Diem is replaced. And now we have a military government in South Vietnam, which just further infuriates those that are fighting for basically freedom against this corruption. They see this as an extension of that corruption. So we jump now to 1964 and Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson, by 1964, has sent 15,000 American advisors to South Vietnam. And the American military is getting a little bit more involved. And we have an incident in 1964 known as the Tonkin Gulf incident. And so Tonkin Gulf is off of North Vietnam. So this isn't in South Vietnam, this is North Vietnam. And with Americans, again, support, two South Vietnamese ships go and attack two small, tiny little North Vietnamese islands off the coast of North Vietnam. This, of course, angers North Vietnam. And what they do is they retaliate. and they attack an American ship called the Maddox, which is sailing in international waters off of North Vietnam. There is no damage to the Maddox, um, but it is an attack, a North Vietnamese attack against a U.S. warship. Word gets back to Washington, D.C. about this, and Johnson is hesitant. He doesn't want to react right away. And then a few days later, there's a report of a second attack against the Maddox and another ship called the Turner Joy. Now, this second attack is kind of ambiguous. We don't know whether or not there actually was an attack. Recent scholarship tends to believe that there wasn't an attack and that the sonar contact that the ships believed they picked up was really just a pod of whales. It was stormy conditions, high waves. There was never any visual contact with the enemy, but they were on high alert. They'd just recently been attacked. And so what you have are American ships, planes scrambling. And once this gets back to Washington, D.C., now Lyndon Johnson does have to react. And what he does is he asks Congress to pass something called the Tonkin Gulf Resolution. And the Tonkin Gulf Resolution gives the Johnson administration basically the ability to wage unrestricted war against North Vietnam. And so this is going to replace a declaration of war. This is going to allow Johnson to use whatever means he feels necessary. This is going to allow Johnson to escalate the war from 15,000 military advisors to 500,000 American troops by the time we get to 1968. I've included the text of the Tonkin Gulf Resolution. See, it's quite short. And as Lyndon Johnson famously said, it was like Grandma's nightshirt. It covered everything.